So welcome to One Spark at a Time with me, Rabbi Adam Miller. A Jewish mystical legend tells that during creation, something broke and shattered, scattering sparks of divine holiness around the world. It's our responsibility to do acts of tikkun olam, to repair the world around us. Each time we do a good deed, we are gathering one more of those sparks and making our world a little more whole and holy. Today, I'm thrilled to be joined by an individual doing this sacred work of repairing our world one spark at a time. Maya Weinstein recently finished law school at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, while she served as president of the Student Bar Association, a graduate intern at the UNC Hillel, a commissioner on the Chancellor's Safety Commission, among her many accolades that she accomplished. Prior to law school, Maya served as a legislative assistant at the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism, where her advocacy work focused on the areas of sexual and domestic violence. Maya, welcome to One Spark at a Time.
Thank you. I'm excited to talk today.
It is a pleasure to have you here. We first met during that year when you were a legislative assistant at the RAC. Your parents had just joined Temple Shalom. How are things for you right now? This is supposed to be the summer of your bar prep, when you focus on getting ready to take the bar. I appreciate you taking time away from that to be with me on One Spark. How has COVID-19 impacted your plans?
Yeah, unfortunately, I'm still studying for the bar, just doing it from home alone. So less fun than maybe it could be, though I think that was a low bar to begin with. But still,
no pun intended.
Yeah, exactly. Not the bar I'd like to be at this summer, but the bar is scheduled for the end of July and in person, and hopefully that'll move forward, get that behind me. Then I'm getting married 2 weeks later and then starting a job 2 weeks later after that. So this was supposed to be a really big summer, and I think it still is. It just looks a little different than I thought it would.
I can imagine it looks a lot different, and that's a lot to throw into one summer. And on top of that, the chaos of the pandemic, you look awfully calm given all that's on your shoulders right now.
Yeah, I have a great therapist, so highly recommend taking care of your mental health.
Indeed, that feels like a one spark for another time of mental health and wellness.
Definitely.
So your next step from here is going to be clerking for Justice Mark Davis of the North Carolina Supreme Court. When did you decide on this path of a career into the law?
Yeah, so as probably many people watching know, my dad's a lawyer. My grandpa was a lawyer. It's something that I've just kind of been around my whole life, and I've watched how that has been a tool for advocacy. I didn't really know what I wanted to do long term after I graduated undergrad, as many people don't, but I was working in policy advocacy and sort of felt like to really help people that I wanted to help, I needed to have a legal education or some advanced degree. And I figured if I went to law school, I could pretty much do anything with that except brain surgery, and have the flexibility to advocate with that knowledge, even if I didn't actively practice law. But Justice Davis is the first Jewish justice on the North Carolina Supreme Court in its 200-year history. He was appointed to the court last year, so I'm really excited to be able to work under him and know how his Judaism and spiritual practice kind of influences his work.
That's fantastic. It's remarkable that in 200 years, he's the first Jewish Supreme Court justice. I'm sure you'll learn some interesting things working under his tutelage and under his wing over the next couple of years. So it sounds like the law is a way for you to address justice, something that you're passionate about, particularly protecting some of the most vulnerable members of our society. Was there a particular person or event that helped you become so engaged in that pursuit?
I think it was a couple of things that just kind of built me into who I am and what I want to do. The first being my parents were always really big activists, especially in advocating for my brother Michael, who I think, hi Michael, Michael's needs in school, and watching how they use different tools to fight and advocate for him along with other kids. And so just being around that, that's just how I saw, you see an injustice, you do something about it. And then I think the biggest turning point for me with making this part of my career plan was when I was an undergrad at George Washington University and I was raped by another student, and the handling of that by the university and others was beyond subpar. And I was basically forced to become an advocate in order to achieve an outcome that was anywhere near where it needed to be for me to be able to finish my education. And what I didn't know was at the time that I was working on that, there was this national movement starting on campuses across the country where this issue of sexual assault was really being pushed to the forefront, and administrators and departments of education were being challenged. And it just so happened that that groundswell was at that exact time. And I saw this bigger picture issue really started advocating on campus, and other survivors came forward to me with just very similar stories. And I felt like I did, like that it was my responsibility to also help them and to build this movement on our campus and beyond. So it wasn't intentional at all, but it led me into this trajectory where all my internships had to do with policy advocacy around sexual violence. I was involved with the RAIN Speakers Bureau. I worked for a law firm that defended students in disciplinary proceedings. And I think having such a personal connection to that really has made me a better advocate. And it's something that I can't really just leave behind, even if I don't do sexual or domestic violence work specifically moving forward. I think it really just kind of fueled my fire of, there are systems that are problematic and you have to do something about them.
That's such a powerful and remarkable piece to share with us, Maya. I know that you just spoke so fluently about this part of your life that was so painful. It takes a lot of courage to be able to tell that story. Did it take you some time to move from that experience into being able to advocate for others?
It did. And it took me 6 months to actually first name what happened to me. And I feel really strongly now about using the word rape instead of lightening it with sexual assault or sexual misconduct, because I think there's power and understanding in what you're saying when you say that. And it takes a lot of people a long time to understand. And after that, it took me a few months to file a report. And then it really was once the mishandling of it became a trauma in its own right that I felt that it was time to speak out, because there was, like, that's not acceptable, being traumatized twice in that way. And part of what happened was I started my advocacy on campus. I did like anonymous interviews with the school paper, and then I started putting my name in it. And then the documentary, The Hunting Ground, which is about sexual assault on college campuses, focusing actually on the University of North Carolina, as well as Florida State and Harvard. The filmmakers reached out to me and I became involved in that as well. And once I was kind of on the Netflix, it really just took off, and I had the opportunity to be a part of national conversations, which was really powerful, connecting with people across the country. And also, of course, the lawn is being mowed right now, so I'm not sure if that's being picked up.
We're not hearing it here. You're okay.
So it was really powerful to connect with people across the country and see what was going on, but also was a really big lesson in when to take a step back and take care of myself and not answer the phone, say no to an interview, and balance other things that I'm interested in, and try not to make it seem like this is who I am and what I am. but it's something that happened to me and influenced who I am today. But I definitely still will get a text from someone that I haven't heard from in a while saying, hey, do you have time to talk? And I know my stomach I just know what it's
Yeah.
going to be. And I'm honored to be that person that people are comfortable talking to. But sometimes I can't help others if I'm not helping myself first. It's putting on the oxygen mask in the airplane on yourself before you can help others. So a lot of lessons in self-advocacy and advocacy for others that came up through that.
It's a powerful image to think of the oxygen mask, taking care of ourselves and recognizing that you want to be able to tell your story and be there for others. But if you don't care for yourself, you'll be able to support them and help them along their way. Has telling your story, you alluded to this a little bit, brought people forward to talk to you who might not have done so otherwise?
Yeah, people have told me that. And I think part of it was when I was an undergrad during all this, I was in Greek life, and that's a realm that really struggles with coming forward and dealing with sexual violence. And I made it a point to talk about it in that context. And I think that opened up a conversation and a willingness to talk. There are people who I've known my entire life who have had their own experiences with sexual violence, and I never knew, and they've told me since. And people are holding a lot, and you don't know what that is. And I think really we kind of talked about this before, hearing other people talk about their experiences with advocacy and traumas, and allows other people to explore how their own identities and experiences fit into that, and gives them the chance to decide whether or not it's healthy or something that they want to come forward and talk about it on their own. But it's also not for everyone to talk about their experiences.
It takes a lot of, as I said, it takes a lot of courage. And so I thank you for being able to share that story with us and being here to talk with us about this important topic. You talked about how your personal experience led you into this area of sexual and domestic violence. Now, how did that connect to your Jewish values that had been instilled in you?
Yeah, I really like to think that my Jewish values are just so intrinsic and part of who I am that it automatically connects. I felt compelled to seek out Jewish texts, Jewish leadership who could talk me through my feelings from a Jewish perspective. I wanted Judaism to stand behind my efforts in advocacy, and I wanted to find evidence that in the Torah we were against sexual and domestic violence. And in some ways, yes, and in some ways, no. And I've really found it interesting to explore those elements specifically in text. I read the Red 10. I thought that was fascinating. The ways that the story of Dinah has sort of evolved over time and what that's meant to people. And I sought out, I was in Sfat, and I went to a mikvah in the middle of the wilderness at midnight in 20-degree weather, and really tried to connect that to my healing as well. And I think the part that's most related is the healing part and how Judaism can help that. But then also knowing that I think Reform Judaism in particular creates this space and connectiveness for social justice and activism, and that is its own vessel to advocacy. And working at the RAC, for example, having a job that was Jewish and I was working on sexual and domestic violence, those are the intersections. Like, I loved that. And that is something that I think is unique to Judaism and how we find ways to support different needs and issues in vulnerable communities through our religious history and text.
it certainly is interesting to look through the text and to see the evolution of our societies around us and the way that they talk about this particular topic. But underlying that, as you noted, was the value of protecting the vulnerable members, that so many times we're instructed in our tradition to protect those who can't care for themselves, the widow, the orphan, the stranger, symbolic of all those who are on the edges, who might be outside of help and needing us to support them and watch over them. You know, along the way, you went from this journey of a very personal experience to working also on a national level, talking with people about sexual and domestic violence. You worked at the Religious Action Center, the center of those national policy conversations. What was that transition like, going from being with your personal narrative to now looking at it on a larger scale?
It was really exciting to feel like I could take everything that I had collected and held in and learned and apply that to make a tangible difference through policy. If policy moved forward, and at least to have those conversations with other entities through coalition and see how other religious groups and non-religious groups were working on these issues, and to have a seat at that table and know that people thought that I had credibility because I worked at the RAC and were willing to listen to me. And then I got to also sit there, and I'm a big nerd, so I really enjoyed sitting there and just listening to what experts that I otherwise, followed on Twitter and thought were really brilliant, but otherwise wouldn't have had the opportunity to be in those rooms with them, developing policy and campaigns and different initiatives.
So you said you found support within the Jewish community to help you through this and to talk about sexual and domestic violence. Where were other communities as you were looking at it from a larger picture? How did other groups address this? Were they in the same place, and is there work to be done?
I think one of the biggest issues with getting groups or organizations to address an issue like sexual or domestic violence is the lack of willingness to look at our own organizations. And it's really easy to say, yeah, this is a problem. Look at these statistics. Of course, this is happening. And then to recognize that if it's happening over there, it's happening over here. We're not any different. And in fact, it might be happening in a different way because of our religion or our culture or our values and how family life looks and is expected to look. So while I think I was pleasantly surprised at how many groups were involved and wanting to be a part of this, there was always kind of this lingering question of how much are you going to do the work and bring it back to your own organization. If you're going to go advocate for this legislation or policy, what does it mean what's your policy when someone comes forward and says this leader is harassing me or this happened to me, another member of the community did this to me? And I think we still have some way to go with that in a lot of ways. And that is kind of what makes it hard to move the needle forward.
So I know you've been very involved right now lately with getting through the bar exam preparation and all those other pieces, but I'm sure your eye is also on the news, particularly in this area. As we've gone through this time of the pandemic of COVID-19 with so many people being isolated at home, how do you think that's impacting domestic and sexual abuse?
Yeah, it's very stressful. I know that JCADA, the Jewish Coalition Against Domestic Abuse, has seen a spike in calls and reports during the pandemic as people are isolated. It's hard enough to leave, but we also know that when there is an economic downturn, when someone loses a job or there's job instability in a home, that increases the risk of potential domestic violence in that home. And obviously that's happening a lot now too. I also worry about violence against children. I have no idea what is happening with that, but I think we really do rely a lot and have trained teachers to identify different signs of child abuse, and children aren't able to go to school. And if they are on video with a teacher, they're doing it from home, which could be an unsafe space. So it is really concerning, and I do not have any answers. But I know that there are a lot of organizations who have been working from, especially Jakarta, from the very beginning of this to try to figure out how to sort of develop like sneaky resources that people can call without an abuser being aware that they're calling or reaching out, and those types of things.
Those are those Facebook posts of message me about this if there's something that you want to talk about that is concerning you in your relationships. It's powerful to recognize the ways we can use the technology to try to help people even during this time. What do you see as the next steps in trying to help people, especially during this moment when we can't really be together?
In terms of sexual and domestic violence?
Yeah.
I don't know. I think education is a really big part of it, and we've already sort of failed in how we educate children on consent, which I think people hear consent in this context and they're like, oh my God, I don't want to talk to my kid about sex. But when I do programs with kids, I'm talking about, okay, if Billy lets you borrow his pencil today, does that mean you can just take it tomorrow? Does that mean that Billy has to give you his pencil again tomorrow? And now that we're out of school, that's just another barrier to not being able to do those educational programs. But I have found, as I've been trying to take breaks from the bar and scroll through Netflix, that I think there's been a lot of really great documentaries on different intersectionalities of sexual and domestic violence, and different celebrities who have been accused and found guilty of various forms of sexual violence. And I'm kind of hoping that people are just laying around and scrolling and they end up watching something like that, and the light bulbs kind of go on. But it's a conversation that I fear we have in waves, and the cycle at some point just needs to stop. And that has yet to happen, but there is more awareness. I mean, I think the biggest excitement when I was at the RAC was I had the opportunity to write the URJ resolution on student sexual violence, which WRJ and MRJ adapted, and then NIFTY drafted their own. So that was an institutional change that was really significant. But it can't just be passing this resolution and saying, look, we did this. Then there has to be a plan for, okay, well, what does that mean? What's our responsibility to this on the ground? So I actually would turn to organizations right now to ask, like, what's your plan, like, for the people who are reaching out to your community? There's not going to be one group that targets everyone. And like I said before, the way that we understand these issues are so specific to our identities and what we know.
So you referenced there a few things for our audience who might not be familiar. URJ is the Union for Reform Judaism, the overarching body for the reform movement. And it's interesting because you noted that the work that you did impacted the WRJ, which is the Women of Reform Judaism, MRJ, which is the Men of Reform Judaism, as well as NIFTY, the youth group. So it's interesting that you're able to start the conversations on all three of those levels with the women, the men, and the youth to have this conversation, because as you said, we need to be talking about sexual and domestic violence. We need to have it as something that we are educating, aware of, and acknowledging its existence. You went from talking on those very large national levels back to a more local experience as you spent the last 3 years at law school at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. For those who aren't familiar, law school can be quite demanding, and not everyone who starts finishes. Despite that high level of difficulty, you were extremely active on campus, particularly in this issue. How were you able to invest your time and energy? What inspired you and kept you moving in that area?
Oh, it's my fatal flaw to sign up for things. Um, well, I really felt like so honestly, I was surprised when I received my acceptance to UNC because in my personal statement, I wrote about my experience with sexual violence, and UNC has kind of a sordid history around sexual violence. Like I said, it
Mm.
was featured in the documentary The Hunting Ground, and even during the past years that I was there, they were still resolving things with the US Department of Education. Getting sanctions for different issues related to sexual violence. So I wasn't sure how much that sort of just took over the campus as a whole. And I really
Hmm.
felt like they were taking a chance on me, letting me come in and being who I was with what I was bringing with me. And that really compelled me to want to invest that energy back into the institution. And I'm like, if you're bringing me here, you know, I'm going to talk about it. So I reached out to different administrators, and it was just really important to me to not just be there, but to where I saw gaps and um, changes that needed to be made to make sure that those were happening both on the law school level and main campus as a whole. So well, I think COVID could be changing some things, but at the time that I was graduating, they were committing to building a new centralized sexual and domestic violence resource center with one high level staff person with an administrative title to oversee
Mm.
all of that, to connect resources across different facets of campus. They were investing a good amount of money in it. Um, and that's something that I really never thought would actually happen. So I just don't shut up. I just keep showing up to meetings, and they're like, oh, we'll do what you want to get you out of here. But that was more my experience at GW. And I think at UNC, I was very honest about my experience at GW. I think they were very aware of their own history. And I was like, you can't let this repeat. So it was important for me to get involved on that level.
And you certainly never let up on the advocacy, on being honest and being forthright. We've talked about this a little bit. The subjects of sexual and domestic violence can make others feel uncomfortable, whether it's because they want to resist or are reluctant to talk about it, thinking that it's something that doesn't happen, it's something behind closed doors, it's not here kind of mentality. How do you engage or approach others in these difficult conversations, getting them outside of what might be their comfort zone?
Well, I do think that you have to be willing to understand that people are coming with their own backgrounds and educations and experiences, and not assume why they might be feeling a certain way about the issue, or just go on the attack because of what they know and what they've seen. But I also think that there are some points where you kind of just have to put it all out there. And sort of going back to like why I use the word rape, I think sometimes you just need to cut to the chase and be clear about what's happening. People, I think young people are more willing to talk about it. I have talked to a lot of youth groups. I went to the Kutz camp for a few summers, the Nifty leadership camp, and spoke there, and everyone was really engaged and voluntarily came to my programs during their free time, which I think says something really great about
Yeah.
future leadership. But I think the bigger barrier is actually like older generations. And sometimes I've learned that that's because, especially women, though it's not just women who experience sexual and domestic violence, did experience something like decades ago. And it's taken this long to really start processing it. And that's really a difficult conversation for them to have for that reason. Um, not because they don't understand, they very much understand. And then I think that there's just still a lot of myths and misconceptions that do pose barriers to people being open to talking about it. I think false accusations is something that people really like to talk about, but we don't talk about false accusations of robbery and it's the same rate. I see a lot like, oh, I'm afraid that my son is going to be falsely accused in college. And it's more likely that your son is going to be raped than falsely accused. And it's concerning to me that that is where the mindset is, and that someone who is victimized in that way, like maybe wouldn't be comfortable coming forward because they're so afraid that everyone else is holding these misconceptions.
That generational piece is an important part. And I imagine by being able to share your story, perhaps you're helping others unlock the strength they need to be able to tell some of theirs. So this is both a chance for us to have a conversation as well as for others to be able to ask questions. So I'll remind those who are like to, you can put them in the Q&A box on our Zoom or put them on Facebook. I'll let you know that on Facebook right now, it's a little bit of a kvelling fest as your family is watching, your parents are on there and they're very proud of you. One question that came in, I think is very relevant to what we're talking about right now, which is a question of, when it comes to domestic and sexual violence, do you feel if people want to work in this area, should they be putting their energy more towards the national conversation or the local efforts, recognizing that while we'd like to do all of the above, there's only so much time and energy that we have?
Yeah, I'm a big advocate for local advocacy, especially coming from DC and seeing it here on the ground. You don't start at the Supreme Court, right? Like you start local. And I think I understand and used to see these big organizations in this big picture, but and that's all really important and is influencing a lot of policy and change. But there are people in your community and in your neighborhood who are in need, and you're the person in the best position to help them, not someone in DC. So starting local, I think, and helping your own community has really vital importance that sometimes we forget about. And the chain reaction of grassroots work, I think we've seen that with protests, seeing it happen in one place and then it happens in another and another. Same with college campuses. And in the first weeks of me being at UNC, UNC had a Confederate monument named Silent Sam, and that was brought down by anti-racist activists during my first year, and that was kind of in this area the beginning of that. And you really have to start somewhere. But I think normally the national conversation is like, it's a little different. There's direct advocacy, and then there's the big picture policy advocacy, but there's also local policy. And that I think there's sort of a lack of awareness because the national issues get so much attention. But the way that different states handle sexual and domestic violence, up until recently, North Carolina, you weren't able to withdraw consent during sex. So if something happened that escalated it, that wasn't what you wanted, if you said you wanted to stop and the person didn't, that wasn't considered rape or sexual assault or anything. Up until recently. So there are these things on the books that people don't necessarily know about until it comes up, and then it gets the right attention and the right resources behind it. And so I think it's kind of keeping an eye out for those things that are happening locally that eventually, that led other states to say, what do we have going on here? So I say local.
Yeah. I'm sure that will inspire some of our listeners to start doing some more local research as well as advocacy and learning what's happening in the places where they are. talking about your work on a national level. A couple of people have asked questions along the lines of wondering what it was like to, and I shared this with you earlier, to be in the rooms where it happens, to be there in the halls of Congress. Did you have any wow moments as you were there at the Religious Action Center?
Yeah, so I'd lived in DC for 4 years before I started at the RAC, and I sort of felt like, oh, I already know all this, like it's lost its luster. I've seen this building before. But when you're actually going and having meetings and, you know, wearing a suit and your nice work bag, you do feel like you're a part of it. There's not really one thing that I can point to, but when we were doing Lit-Talk-Hen, whenever we brought high school students to meet with their members of Congress, it was just really powerful to see how these students had, if they either came in passionate about a topic or they just learned about it for the first time that weekend, they educated themselves on it. They figured out how it connected to them personally or the people that they cared about, and they went and they lobbied lawmakers and they demanded respect. I will never forget being in a meeting with a senator who I will not name, who was so rude to the students and just sort of blew them off. Like, you don't know what you're talking about. Let me tell you. And this kid was like, no, I've seen it myself. I know this issue. It was about gun violence. I've experienced it. My friends have experienced it. This is real. Like, you can't tell me I don't know what I'm talking about just because I'm a kid. And I thought I really respected this student for that. And I think that it's important to see that you can, like, these people are just people who like ran in an election and now they get to make decisions, and not being too intimidated by them, especially when they're not taking you seriously and are trying to exert some level of power over you. I think that is actually like the fact that we were able to get those students into the room, and they made it happen. It wasn't happening until they got there.
Look, it's amazing when you see those students learning to advocate, when you see anybody finding their voice and recognizing that their story has power and that they have a voice, and they have a reason, and they have the ability to influence others with the sharing of that story and trying to move things in a better direction. So a couple people have asked questions about whether you were able to involve yourself in other activities besides your advocacy work on sexual and domestic violence. And in particular, they're curious about Jewish life on campus. Israel on campus is certainly an issue that we hear about a lot in the news, and it's something we hear about in our communities. What is it that you were seeing at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and what can you share with us?
Yeah, so I was the graduate student intern, which was a really great experience, and I got to engage graduate and professional students across campus, Jewishly. A lot of it was social, but it's really hard in a place like North Carolina to connect in that way. So that really brought me to be able to see what was happening across campus. And I think being in the law school, though, I was a little insulated from like the typical big debates that were happening on campus, especially around Israel and other political issues. But something that was really present was anti-Semitism. And I know that my first year of law school, there was a swastika drawn on a board. On campus, there were flyers distributed that said something along the lines of, Jews are the biggest threat to all other religions. Lots of swastikas, wow. Big swastika theme. And then a lot of microaggressions. I met a lot of students who had never knowingly met a Jewish person before, and all of those stereotypes and tropes were there with them. It kind of forced me, I mean, I could have let it go, but that would have made my experience really uncomfortable, and it kind of forced me to become the like Jewish liaison and educate them on like, yeah, I don't know what you mean when you say you don't look Jewish, because what does that mean? And those types of things, money jokes and even Holocaust jokes. And I think what I did find is that people were really open to a transformative experience. And I have a really good friend now who we started off that way, with the discomfort and the inappropriate comments about Jewishness. And he was one of the people who's been there for me most after different attacks on the Jewish community. But I have found, so I was on the Campus Safety Commission, which was created by the chancellor. Mostly after around Silent Sam, there were a lot of white supremacist groups that came to campus to protest. There were a lot of threats of the KKK coming to campus. And that also kind of put the Jewish community in a position of feeling threatened, and especially when Hillel has like a giant Star of David on the window. And so, and a lot of communities felt threatened by that. So the Campus Safety Commission was formed to just deal with many issues of safety on campus. When a couple of us raised the issues of anti-Semitism, there was just a drastic lack of understanding about what anti-Semitism was, how that impacted students. And also I found that when those issues like swastikas were brought up, the response would be to try to bring in the Israel conversation and say like, well, is it anti-Semitism if it's anti-Israel? And I'm like, I'm talking about a swastika. Like, I'm not even there yet. Like, we will get there. And in a way, it sort of turned into this distractor of we can't even talk about the undebatable, undeniable aspects of anti-Semitism, because the groups that didn't want to talk about anti-Semitism wanted to talk about Israel. And I think that anti-Israel is very like situational and depends on the circumstances and the context of how it's being used, what it's being used to do, what the underlying intent is. And it never, during my time, it was never really something that I the conversation didn't really go very far on that. In the campus safety context, I know that there are a lot of undergrad students who are really involved, but I didn't see it as much as a law student.
You know, I think we're aware of the anti-Israel sentiment. I imagine for some that's eye-opening to hear about the anti-Semitism, particularly the open swastikas and other pieces showing up on campus. It's good to know that there's a commission and that you're engaging in the education side of things, but it's also a little alarming to hear that these things are still happening in such an open forum. Going back to your conversation earlier about elected officials and advocacy, we've gotten a question on Facebook wanting to know, do you see yourself taking a path someday from advocacy and the work that you have ahead of you into being an elected official?
I do not. I served as president of the Student Bar Association in my last year, which is the student government of the law school. And it turns out that I just don't like to play the games that are often required with political leadership. And I do like to be in the room and I like to be an advocate. I think that if someone else wants to run and wants to bring me on as their chief of staff, I am there. But I think I'm going to use different tools for advocacy for now. But as we talked about before, judges in North Carolina are elected. So that's something that I would maybe be a little more comfortable with.
Okay. we won't put you on the spot to decide your life path from now for the next 50 years, but it said something about the power of your voice and the impact that you're having on our audience, that they see that potential in you and in what you're doing right now. You truly, Maya, have this tireless passion to address these issues that would exhaust many. What gives you hope as you continue to do this work of advocacy?
Well, like I said, being in the rooms with students who are advocating, I see a lot of grassroots campus advocacy, and that is really uplifting. It's hard. I think it's hard to have hope right now, when we have no idea how long our quarantines will be extended. But I also think it used to be that there was an incident and then there would be a big conversation on social media for like 2 days and then it would go away. And maybe the blessing of quarantine is that people don't have anything else to do and are really immersing themselves in conversations and issues and education. And I think people are more willing to have difficult conversations and to educate themselves. And that's the biggest thing. Just read a book, watch a documentary. It's little things, but you start learning about something that you didn't know about before or didn't understand. And I think that gives me hope.
Well, we certainly hope that hope is contagious. A final question for you as we conclude our conversation. Your path is taking you to a place where you're working to make a world that is more just and holy. What would you say to others who might see areas of need but have unsure of taking that first step, haven't yet decided what they want to do or what they can do to repair the world themselves?
Well, you don't have to leave the house to be an advocate and an activist. And I think
that's good for quarantine.
It is. It really is. And I think that kind of takes some of the intimidation factor away a little bit. There's so many ways to, like I was just saying, just educating yourself. You start figuring out, wait, I connect with this. I understand this. This is something that I saw happen at this school or in this community. Maybe I can get involved in this way. And just being open to learning about different issues and what those look like in your community. And also trying not to be intimidated, because it turns out that a lot of people don't know what they're doing, and just being willing to put yourself in the position to help someone out, just being a voice, especially sexual and domestic violence. The important thing, if someone comes forward to you, like, don't tell them what to do. Don't tell them how to handle their trauma or their grief. I think it's just being someone who's there to listen, and helping that person figure out their own path and journey. That is activism, and that's being an advocate. So I don't think it has to be walking the halls of Congress, which is exciting, but doesn't necessarily make a difference depending on who you're talking to. It's voting, it's helping others vote. And I really do think that figuring out how you can get involved locally is a really great step into advocacy.
Fantastic. Maya, thank you so much for joining me today, for sharing your passionate pursuit of justice. This time of COVID-19, as we've talked about a few times, has given us an awareness of our blessings as well as a heightened sensitivity to those who might be in need. Each time we have a One Spark, we take the time to highlight some ways that others can help volunteer, provide help. One of the things I think that's relevant here is earlier we had a One Spark with Linda Oberhaus from our local women's shelter for domestic violence. The shelter is always looking for resources, and there are ways that you can help them accomplish their goals here. So if you're interested and passionate in acting locally on the subject of domestic and sexual violence, I encourage you to connect with the women's shelter here in Naples. And I'll also let our audience know that we have a local film series called Movies That Matter. And these are social justice films co-founded by Temple Shalom, the Jewish Federation of Collier County, the Naples Holocaust and Education Center, as well as Jen Shoah. This is a great opportunity, these films, to learn about contemporary issues. And one of the films they're showing this year on October 28th is called Telling Amy's Story, which is about domestic violence. So it's another way that people can further their learning and listening and understanding for this important topic. Friends, as we come to a conclusion, I want to thank all those who are in our audience, watching or listening to One Spark at a Time with me, Rabbi Adam Miller, and my guest today, Maya Weinstein. If you missed any part of this experience or want to watch other episodes, the full video will be available on the Temple Shalom of Naples YouTube page. You can also find One Spark at a Time on your favorite podcast provider. As Gandhi taught, be the change you want to see in the world. Know that as we part ways, I hope that you have gained the inspiration to embrace this teaching, knowing that you too have the power to fix our broken world, one spark at a time.